We're in Mark chapter 16. Mark 16. We're going to finish up Mark tonight. I didn't hear any applause, but we've been in it quite a while, so we're going to finish up tonight. Do this last chapter, do the resurrection, and so if you want to go ahead and study for next week, we're going to do the first three chapters of Joshua. So we'll start in Joshua next week if you want to go ahead and look ahead a little bit. So tonight we're in chapter 16, and one of the things that leads us to chapter 16, or the thing that leads us to chapter 16, is what we just studied in chapter 15, which is the trials of Jesus. Jesus being turned over by Pilate to be crucified. Jesus is mocked. By the way, before he turns him over, he is whipped. He receives this thrashing. Then he's turned over to be crucified. He's mocked. He's made fun of, hit, spit on, all of that. And then there is the crucifixion. He dies. That death is witnessed by some. You notice at the end of it, before he's buried, there were women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and the younger, and Joseph and Salome. So there were some who were looking on, and then he was reviled even further, and then finally the death and the burial that takes place there at the end of chapter 15. The lesson in chapter 15 is quite heart-wrenching, and I think part of the reason that it's not more heart-wrenching is because we've never seen a crucifixion. We've never been around the crucifixion. We've never heard the cries, seen the blood. We've never seen that, have we? We've never seen anything like that, and yet we try to visualize it. We try to come to grips with it at least a little bit to kind of understand the depth of the love of God and the depth of the love of Jesus, and how he would go to that length to demonstrate God's love and his commitment to the will of God. So I think that's one of the reasons that it's not even more gruesome and not more of a mental picture that hurts more, is because we've just never seen it. It is not that easy to, I think, bring up as a reality in our minds. So we look at that from a distance. We look at it from our viewpoint, this distance away. So you have the burial that takes place at the end of chapter 15. He's taken down, partially prepared for burial, and he is put in a tomb that was fulfillment of the prophecies of the Old Testament, and being a borrowed tomb. So now we're going to come to the next part of that gospel message, which is the resurrection. The death, the burial, and then the resurrection. The very idea of the resurrection was something that was also difficult for the present day people to comprehend. Jesus had been talking about it. Remember, Mark has referred to Jesus talking about the death, burial, and resurrection up to this time, talking to his disciples about this time and this day when it would come. But they didn't understand it. They could not come to grips with the fact that Jesus would die, much less the fact that he would be resurrected. So once the Sabbath is complete, the women go to the tomb to finish that burial process that wasn't finished on the eve before the Sabbath. So on this Sunday morning, they go there in order to see the finish of this burial process. And in the first century, and under the Jewish custom, there was no embalming, there was no preservation of the body. It was only herbs and spices and wrapping in a burial cloth with something like 70 pounds of herbs and spices that would basically only cover up the scent of the decay of the body. So that was really the purpose of it, to keep the stench of the decay down. The body would be allowed to decay over time, and as a matter of fact, it wasn't unusual for them to take a body that had been buried in a tomb and move it away, move it to a less conspicuous spot, and you would have many bodies or many skeletons left that would be in a tomb, and you might use that same place there several times over. So here Jesus is put in this tomb, and the process of him beginning to experience this decay would have begun by the time the ladies get there on that Sunday morning. The place that they go to is a place of burial, obviously, and it's been covered with a stone. The purpose for that would possibly be mostly for wild animals, keep animals out. So they go to that place, and as a result of going there, they find the stone rolled away, the tomb is empty, and a young man there who speaks to them and tells them that the Jesus they seek is not there. So let's read 16. Well, let's just read 1 through 8, and that gets us to the next section. Mark 16, 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb, and they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him? But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Let's stop there and get some idea of what we see taking place here. They go to the market. I guess one of the reasons they are at the time arriving at the tomb that they are is they had to go to the market first, very likely. So they bought the spices and they arrived there, and as they're getting there, they wonder how they're going to get the stone rolled away so they can get in and complete this burial process. But when they got to the tomb, they saw that the very large stone had been rolled away. There's great emphasis by Mark because he says the stone was very large. So the emphasis is there in the text that we just read. The stone was very large. They entered the tomb, and what were they looking for? Well, they're looking for the body of Jesus. When they went into the tomb, They didn't see the body of Jesus, but they saw a young man dressed in white. Are we to assume this is an angel, or is it really a young man? Well, the young man says, by just the very text, he says, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Now, there's a lot that this person tells these women. But notice the first thing he says is, do not be alarmed. But they are, aren't they? They're alarmed. I think the whole situation is an alarming situation. The description when they leave is that they were trembling and astonished. It says that the trembling and astonishment seized them. I don't know if you've ever been in that kind of situation or not. You ever been in a situation where you got news and it causes you to tremble? Maybe your knees get weak. You got some kind of bad news or something happened, an almost accident, something like that. Well, it says they were trembling and astonished, and then it says they were afraid as they left. They didn't say anything to anybody. They were afraid. Now, we'll go a little deeper into that in just a moment, this idea of afraid. But this young man who's sitting at the right side, interesting that Mark would tell us exactly where he's sitting at the right side. He's dressed in a white robe. This would alarm them. The body's not there would alarm them. And so this whole situation is very alarming. And then he gives them this message. The message is, he is not here. He is risen. You're looking for the Jesus who was crucified. Notice that specific detail. He was crucified. So the emphasis is upon dead, right? He was dead. But now he is risen. Dead, risen. Okay? A message from this young man, this angel, from God to the women. He is not here. He was crucified, but he is risen. You can look here at this place where they laid him, and he's not there. Now, if you look at the other accounts of this discovery of the empty tomb, it's going to give you some other information about a burial cloth and those kind of things. But Mark doesn't give us any of that information. He just evidently points, see the place where he was laid. This is where they laid him when they buried him. And it's empty. The place where they laid him is empty. Now, he continues his message by saying that you should go tell his disciples, and there's those two little words, and Peter. Note the significance of go tell the disciples, and the message that he gives them that they need to tell the disciples is that Jesus is going to meet you, or is actually going to be ahead of you and meet you in Galilee, which is what he told them before. He told them he would go before them. He will see you, or there you will see him just as he told you. So the disciples are to be told by these women to go to Galilee, and Jesus will meet you there, just like he said he would. All right, so let me stop there. That's kind of the end of the message of the young man in the tomb. After that, the ladies, verse 8, the ladies leave, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But through verse 7, maybe you have some comments some observations or something at this time. Sure, yes.
He had to be just in a state of mind. So they could have come to him and said, "Hey guys, Jesus is busy." Peter said, "You know, I don't even want to go because I'm not too ashamed to go."
Mm-hmm.
I think that was him telling Peter, "Don't be ashamed. Just come on."
Yeah, giving Peter that little bit of it's worked out, even though you never thought things would work out. Remember last week we talked about the chaos, and Peter's right in the midst of all this chaos, and he makes part of that chaos by denying Christ 3 times. So it's just looked like chaos. But remember, this is what God wanted. This is exactly the way God wanted it to turn out. So it's not chaos. From a human standpoint, it looks like chaos. But Peter's life, as Barry points out, Peter's life is in a difficult point right now. Remember, he has not been reinstated. John chapter 20 hasn't happened yet. That's going to happen much later after the resurrection of Jesus, where Jesus is going to reinstate Peter and say, "Feed my sheep," and you know that goes on there in chapter 20, where Jesus has breakfast with those fishermen. And I think the "and Peter" part is an emphasis. You make sure Peter knows that I've been resurrected. Yeah.
About the spices and whatever it was, and headed to the tomb. And there's supposed to be a rock and closing off the tomb. They're supposed to be Roman guards.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what were they expecting?
I know they didn't know how they were going to get it open. They didn't know how because obviously they couldn't roll the stone away, so they were going to need some help. So they went with some kind of belief that they were going to get in somehow. Right.
There you got Mark identifies one angel, and Luke, I believe, 2 angels.
Mm-hmm.
That probably could be an explanation for that, is that Mark identifies an angel that speaks.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is no discrepancy in Scripture there, because you've got 2 in one gospel and 1 in Mark's. I think what Mark is simply doing is identifying the one who's doing the speaking in this particular scene here in Mark 16.
The Gospel of Mark, it was the first one written, am I correct?
I believe you're right, yes.
So maybe Luke comes behind him and cleans up some stuff.
Yeah. And he seemed to have more time than Mark thought he had. Mark seems to be just giving us the bare bones at times. Remember, early on we talked about it from Mark's perspective. He deals with the baptism of Jesus and the temptation of Jesus in about 3 verses each, and Luke takes 11 verses just for the temptation of Jesus. So Mark's kind of moving along with his story. He's not taking a lot of time to insert some of the facts that Matthew and Luke does.
You know, in this young man, doesn't they say something about he was illuminated or he was bright or something? Or is that?
I think maybe one of the other Gospels mentions the brightness of his clothing or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Which would help us usually identify them as an angel if they have this bright apparel. Most of the time when they say something like dressed in white apparel, like it does here, it's going to be referring to that. Now I did read, I'll just put this in there, put it out there, that there was one commentator who said he believed that this young man in the tomb was Mark. Now, he didn't have any proof for that. He didn't even have any suggestion for proof. I guess he just thought he would throw that in. But seems like an angel to me. I don't believe it was a human being. because the other accounts, as Mari's mentioned, describe an angel doing what this young man in the tomb did. All right, any other comments? So Peter had dramatically failed the Lord, and so there is this brokenheartedness of Peter that has been stewing now for hours, right? For days, a full day on the Sabbath, and now here we are. Here we are on the Sunday. So now Peter is going to learn with the other disciples that his life's not over. He hasn't failed completely. He failed, but there's going to be a time for change, repentance. There's going to be a renewal. You're going to get back in the game, so to speak, that idea. Now, this section ends quite abruptly. Now, you move to chapter 16, verses 9 and following, and you have Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene. Jesus appears to two disciples. And then you're going to have Jesus giving what we often refer to as the Great Commission in Mark 16, beginning in verse 15 and following, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. And then there's this kind of conclusion where it says that the Lord, after he had spoken to them, was taken up to heaven and sat down at the right hand of God, and they went out and preached everywhere while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs and wonders. Okay, so that is a pretty quick conclusion, but this first section of chapter 16 concludes very strongly in verse 8, because it describes the state of the women as they leave the tomb. Now, I've already referred to the idea of the trembling and the astonishment and how that had seized them. It had overwhelmed them. They were overcome by this, seems to be the idea. Grief, stress, strife, struggle, all those things you might be feeling that are going to give you this response in your physical body. We know what that's like. And so that's kind of what's going on here. And it says they didn't say anything to anybody. Now, do I believe that later on they went on and said something to the disciples? I believe they did. That's what they were supposed to do. But at that time, as they made their way, it's not like they're going to stop somebody on the street and say, hey, did you hear about the Lord's resurrection? And as they move on down the street, hey, did you hear about our Lord? He's resurrected. They didn't stop to talk to anybody, it seems, and they ultimately, I think, moved on to talk to the disciples and Peter. But the very end, it exclaims this theme that Mark has dealt with quite a lot, and it's that theme of fear. Fear versus faith. And when you look back at the Gospel of Mark, and I did a very quick survey, a very quick looking back over what we've already studied about the highlight of fear throughout the book, and it seems to be a very significant theme that Mark picks up on a lot through his gospel. So just, if you would go with me, let's go back to chapter 5, and let's look at this idea, because the resurrection of Jesus Christ is a glorious event. It's a God-made event. And it's one of those events that changes the direction of humanity. It changes everything, because now you have the power of God being demonstrated. You have the empty tomb that's proof of the resurrected Lord. Yet, how did it affect these women who came to the tomb? They were trembling. They were affected. They were full of fear, and that just kind of ends there with that. And then Jesus starts appearing to some as you look in verse 9 and as you look in verse 12. and then he appeared to the 11 in verse 14. But look back at chapter 5, and I think you'll see some of this theme of fear that's taking place. 5:15, 15 through 17. Let's go back to 14. The herdsman fled and told it in the city and in the country that people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had their legion, sitting there clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. All right, so they saw the work of Jesus. They saw what Jesus could do. And we've already gone over this about the casting of the evil spirits and the pigs. But the statement is the casting out of the unclean spirits from a man, and the people in the city and the country saw what had happened, and it said they were afraid. Now skip down to still in chapter 5, verse 33. Back up to verse 32. This is the healing of Jairus' daughter, but then you have this woman who has the issue of blood. Verse 31, the disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. So there you have the woman who is filled with fear and trembling. But she knows that the thing she has to do is touch Jesus. So she moves and does that. Look at verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what he said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. So you see this whole theme of fear, and this is just in chapter 5. We see 3 different accounts where Jesus cast out the evil spirits from a man. The next was the woman, and then the next was the healing of the daughter of Jairus' daughter who had died, telling him to not be full of fear, but be full of faith or belief. Chapter 6, verse 50. Now, I may be skipping over some because I didn't look for everything. I just wanted to kind of get a sampling because there's a lot of this through the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 6, verse 45. Jesus is walking on water, and this is one of those very classic examples of fear where the disciples are in the boat. They're going to the other side to Bethsaida. He dismissed the crowd. He'd taken leave of them, went to the mountain to pray, and they got in a boat. He was on land, and they saw him making headway painfully. They saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them, and about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. So there's another instance of the fear. They were terrified, and he says, do not be afraid. Take heart, do not be afraid. Look at another one, chapter 9. I'll go over to chapter 9. Verse 38. No, let's go back to, I should have said 30. Verse 30. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed after 3 days, he will rise. Okay, so here's one of those accounts where Jesus is trying to prepare the disciples for his death, saying, "But I will rise after 3 days." But they did, verse 32, but they did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. And they were afraid to ask him. So Jesus said, I'm going to die, they're going to kill me, but after 3 days I'll rise, preparing them for the day that happens in chapters 15 and 16 of the Gospel of Mark, and especially chapter 16, his resurrection. So that's 9:32. Look at 11, chapter 11, verse 18. Jesus cleanses the temple, beginning in verse 15. He would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Verse 18, and the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So that's 11:18 specifically. The Jewish leaders were in great fear of Jesus, but mostly here because of the people. They were afraid because the crowd was astonished at Jesus' teaching, so they were full of fear because of that. There are several other accounts of that very same idea. 11:32 is another one. Go over to chapter 12. This is a different one. They're trying to arrest Jesus. Jesus just told the parable of the tenants, chapter 12, verses 1 through 11. Verse 12, and they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them, so they left him and went away. So verse 12, the Jewish leaders specifically are described here as fearing the people. Fear, I think, is a critical theme throughout the Gospel of Mark. As we've just seen, like I said, I probably overlooked some, and for sake of time, I didn't want to go through there and just look at every word every time fear was used. But the point of fear in many of these contexts is that the audience or the Jewish leaders they have a lack of understanding. There's a lack of proper understanding of what is taking place in front of them. A lack of understanding of who Jesus is, of what he came to do, of what kind of kingdom he is ushering in, of exactly how they are to respond, or in some cases, as in the case of these religious leaders, part of their fear was prompted by their fear of losing what they had, losing their power, losing their people, losing all of that. So what takes place now in verses 1 through 8 of chapter 16 is something that should wipe away the fear, shouldn't it? The disciples were afraid. The followers of Jesus were afraid. Those that saw him cast out the demons were afraid. The fact that there is now a proven resurrection from the dead is giving hope in place of fear. I think that is just kind of a crescendo of completion by Mark as he reaches this final end of the resurrection of Jesus, and the fear should be wiped out. Do not fear. Believe. Do not fear. Come to an understanding. The tomb is empty. He was crucified, but the tomb is empty. no more fear. There's no place for it. No more fear.
You think about it, we tend to be in the world, we don't think of the spiritual or miraculous. And as humans, we don't like change, and whether we admit it or not, for good or bad. Think about times in your life when you've been blessed, you have a new job. What's the first thing you feel? Fear.
Fear,
Can
yes.
I do this? You have a child. What's the first thing you feel? Fear. Can I do this? He wants us to quit thinking worldly and relying on ourselves and believe and rely on Him.
That's a great point, Ryan, and I think that's what he's been trying to get them to do all along. Remember when he has the loaf of bread in the boat and he says, stop thinking physical. You're thinking about where your next meal is going to come from. What I want you to do is start thinking from the viewpoint of the spiritual. Great point. All right, anything else? I think our time's gone, but any other comments? I hope you've enjoyed this study through Mark. I've loved studying it and teaching it, so I hope you got a little bit out of it as much as I did.